Hello, everybody. Brendan Patrick from Podcana here to bring you a Ruby Amethyst tips video. I brought this deck to my set championships last weekend, was able to win 2 events, going undefeated in both. I want this video to be less of a deck tech, going in on the specific cards, and more just about some of the core tips that I have for specific matchups if you're looking to bring Ruby Amethyst to the set championships. Going into weekend 2, I do think that this is still a good pick. While Ruby Amethyst is not a fantastic deck, in my opinion, in terms of power level, I don't think it does anything fundamentally unfair like the Whole New World decks or the blue-red deck. It is a very consistent deck, and it does punish your opponent very much for stumbling or potentially not knowing how to mulligan correctly. It also has a very smooth matchup spread. It has game into literally everything. You have almost no auto loss matchups, and I feel like this is a deck where if you have the practice and you feel comfortable, you're very favored to do well at these set championships. At least get top 4. At least get yourself a stitch, right? So first things first, while this is not going to be an in-depth deck tech, I want to talk about some of the cards. First off, we have the 9 1-drops. I like playing 9 over 8. You can play 8, of course, but I like the additional consistency. Also, the 1-drops in conjunction with the 4 Merlin's Crab can be really good into some of the harder matchups, like potentially Amber Steel, but also Green Steel. There is a lot of Green Steel showing up at these events, and that can be a particularly hard matchup. So the 1-drops do help. We also have the 4 Kuzco. This is pretty popular, but I would say it's not set in stone. One thing about Kuzco is it's extremely good in the mirror. In the mirror, often it's much better than your other turn 2 play in the form of Madam Mim, and you can use things like Crab to come down on 3 on curve to actually trade the Kuzco out and draw that card. It also insulates you against big Be Prepareds. Just a fantastic card in the mirror. Can be middling in some other matchups, but of course it's inkable. We of course have the 1 Pinocchio. You can play 2 Pinocchio. You can cut the Pinocchio. It's fine. Overall, having a single one of in your deck is not going to be that impactful. In Lorcana, it's more appropriate than a game like Magic the Gathering because the mulligan in this game is so extremely powerful. So if you have a polarizing matchup like something like Emerald Amethyst, and you know Pinocchio is your one way to kill the 2/3 Ursula that double sings friends on the other side or double sings some sort of discard effect, then you can hard mulligan for your Pinocchio, and that can be correct. Of course, you can go up on the Pinocchios. The card is uninkable, so in matchups where it doesn't do a lot, it can be really, really bad. I played 2 on the weekend. I'm now going back down to 1. I think it's totally fine. I think even if you don't have the Pinocchio against those Ursulas, those matchups don't get much better if you have the single Pinocchio in your deck. You just got to deal with this kind of being a bad matchup. You can mulligan for it, and that's about it. We have the two Maleficent Sorceress. This is kind of an interesting pick. It's in a lot of Ruby Amethyst decks, but why 2? Mostly because I want more of other cards, and I just don't have the spots. I'm a 4 Crab kind of guy. I think Crab is one of the best cards in the game. It allows you to trade your Minnie Mouse in the mirror, which is probably the most impactful play you can make on the draw. It also lets you trade your Kuzco up. I mean, the Crab, and of course, if your opponent drops a location on you, Crab plus Madam Mim Fox, that's going to be 7 damage, so you're clearing most castles in one hit. You're clearing Pride Lands in pretty much one game action. Really, really important. I'm huge on 4 Crab. The other card I'm a 4 of on is Minnie Mouse Surfer. I see tons of people putting 3 of these in their deck. I don't know how. I think this card is one of the best cards in Ruby Amethyst, but also I think it's one of the best cards at the set championship because people absolutely do not appreciate how aggressive this deck can be, and Minnie Mouse is the key to do that. I actually cannot articulate how many matches that I was on the play, going first, played Minnie Mouse on 3, Minnie Mouse on 4, and my opponent literally could do nothing to win the game because they were not expecting that, both in the mirror and against blue-red. We'll talk more about those strategies specifically, but I like to play 4 Minnie Mouse. And I would pretty much never go down to 3. I think that it's incredible. Okay. Next up, the list is very standard. The only thing we have here is the split between Medusa and Lady Tremaine. You can go 4 Tremaine, 3 Medusa, or 4 Tremaine, 1 Medusa. That's fine. You can go 4 Tremaine, 2 Medusa. It's up to you, or 4 Medusa. Literally whatever you think your metagame is going to be. I think Medusa has a larger spread in the metagame than something like Lady Tremaine. Lady Tremaine also does get hit by the Medusa, so it's a bit of a higher risk card, but if you're facing things like Tamatoa, Cinderella, the big one, Tremaine is very, very important for some of those matchups and some of those very troublesome characters your opponent can drop on you. That being said, Medusa hits most things in the game. My split, if I wasn't playing 3-2, I'd probably play 4 Medusa, 1 Tremaine. Not having Tremaines especially when your opponent knows you don't have Tremaines, can be pretty hard against people, doing, Amber Steel playing some greedy Cinderellas against you, shifting that out, knowing you don't have the Tremaine, knowing you can only get rid of it with Be Prepared. They have options. So I like the split, to be honest. I could see going up in these cards, but that's about it. Everything else is standard except the 4. We have 4 Castle. I think Castle's amazing. You could side down to 3. You could make that argument. I would not. I think Castle's very, very impactful in some of your hardest matchups, like Green Steel. And it's also just like, it's such a knowledge-based card, I feel like, because often the times you need to make a judgment call whether your opponent has the cards to clear it or not. And if they don't, sometimes you instantly win the game. And that is very much a judgment call, like I said. But there's often times where you'll be in games, like I was in one of my finals where I was playing against Emerald Amethyst, where I had the castle as a play. My opponent had a crab on board. They could totally have the Madam Mim Fox cleared immediately. But I was such an underdog in that matchup, and I was so far behind that I said, I know that my only way back into this game is castle. I just have to make my opponent have it. They didn't, and the castle ended up winning me the game. So the castle is just super powerful. There's a lot of decks that can't deal with it. Obviously, the draw effect is crazy, but I can't imagine just not having it in my deck. Even if it's going to be inked a lot of the time, even if it gets hit by bare necessities, it is just such a powerful card, especially in the mirror. Because in the mirror, you have a card like Be Prepared that can clear your entire board. But if you insulate your board with something like a castle, your opponent is less incentivized to be prepared, because when they're be preparing, they often can't deal with the castle as well. So just an important card. Last thing I want to talk about is a 3 Be Prepared. So people will ask me, like, they're really big on this one. Why 3? And like, wouldn't you want the 4th against Amber Steel and wheel decks? I mean, sure, a 4th would be nice, but to be honest, at my set championships at least, and I expect this to carry over to set 2, to weekend 2, is that Amber Steel and Blue Steel are not really showing up. They're just getting hated out of the format a bit with a lot of blue-red. And with that, I just don't find the need for the 4th Be Prepared. When I have multiple Be Prepareds in hand, it is physically painful. Like, it is so freaking bad. So while this card could be good as a 4 of against, decks that swarm the board a bit more, that you can actually get the 7 ink against, like Amber Steel, that's fine. But overall, even 3 kind of feels like a lot, to be honest. Going down to 2, I'm sure you'll miss it, because, there's plenty of times you have to dig for it as you're only out. But I certainly did not miss 4, and I would not go back up. All right, I said no deck tech. We did a little bit of a deck tech. Let's talk about matchup spread and how to play the matchups. So right now, at least for my local metagame, which is in Dallas-Fort Worth, what's showing up a lot is Ruby Amethyst, which is performing very well, Blue-Red, which is also performing well, and then you have this like scattering of Green Steel, probably is the 3rd most played deck. I would say 4th most played. 4th, 5th, 6th is just a total toss-up between Amber Steel, Blue Steel, and Emerald Amethyst. In those top 3, I think those are completely winnable matchups, but you need to know how to play them. Specifically against Blue-Red, I cannot recommend this card enough. If you are a Ruby Amethyst player, and you're playing against Blue-Red, I genuinely don't think you should try to go to the late game. That should not be your goal. You should never say, I'm going to try to attrition out my Blue-Red player. Their draw package is more powerful than you. Of course, their RAM package is more powerful than you. They'll be on higher ink. They'll likely be drawing more cards, and their cards are better. Their average card quality, as you get into the late game, is significantly higher than yours as Ruby Amethyst, because Ruby Amethyst is not a control deck. It's absolutely a tempo deck at best. So I'd never try to go late versus Blue-Red. Thus, this Minnie Mouse, one of the most powerful things you do. Blue-Red really struggles to deal with this card. They have things like Madam Medusa. They can have the hooks, but that card is not that effective even when it's on the battlefield and you can just ink these. But if you go on the play, turn 1, on the play, and you get to turn 3 and you go Minnie Mouse into Goat or Minnie Mouse into Minnie Mouse, I find that Blue-Red loses that matchup a vast, vast, vast majority of time. They have a hard time dealing with it. They absolutely need to ramp to deal with that as well, to deal with it fast enough. So I love having the Minnie Mouse, and it's absolutely the card I'm mulliganing for against Blue-Red, and it's very, very good. I don't recommend mulliganing for things like Merlin, Rabbit, Friends on the Other Side, and trying to play a long game and attrition out your Blue-Red opponent. I think their deck is simply a better control deck than you. Their card quality is simply better, and you should be on a more aggressive game plan. Speaking of more aggressive game plan, by far the card I see misused the most on the weekend, by far, is Merlin Goat. Often in the mirror, but this is also important against Blue-Red. Blue-Red, this is a very powerful, aggressive card. There are times in a game like, I think as Ruby Amethyst players, we are conditioned to bounce our Merlin Rabbit every single time to draw cards because you get so much value off of it. You bounce your Merlin Rabbit, you play it again, you insulate it against board clears, you insulate it against Madam Medusas. But one thing I almost never see my opponents do, unless they're going to win the game with it, is bounce their Merlin Goat or bounce their Merlin Goat back to stop it from being cleared by something that could be prepared. There are times in a game when the hard part about Ruby Amethyst is there are plenty of times in a game when you need to pivot from being the controlling deck to the beatdown deck or the aggro deck. And that's sort of the key way to play Ruby Amethyst is knowing when to pivot. And Merlin Goat is absolutely a way to do that. And you realize that dichotomy between Merlin Rabbit and Merlin Goat, because there's going to be plenty of times when it is actually not correct to bounce the rabbit. It is not correct. And you could be on 10 lore. You could be on nowhere close to 20, and it's actually correct to play the goat and bounce the goat back to get that additional amount of lore. Simply, you need to realize that I am the aggressor. My opponent needs to respond to me. And then oftentimes it is correct to actually play the goat and bounce the goat. In the mirror, that is also the case. I usually only do that on the play because, of course, card advantage is important in the mirror, and rabbit is very key to that. But I have won so many mirror matches. Actually, I've won every single mirror match. Not necessarily with the strategy, but pretty much all of them with this strategy is playing the more aggressive game plan, coming out more aggressive. And I constantly see my opponents do turn 4, curve into rabbit, start drawing cards, bounce it back, turn 6, play it again. And I'm sitting there on the other side, Minnie, quest, play my Merlin, play my Merlin Goat, bounce my goat, and then play it again. And then next thing you know, I'm in like 15, 16 lore, and they might have 9 cards in hand, and I might have 1. But I ultimately have inevitability with my Merlin Goats in my deck. It's the card I see inked the most in the mirror, and it's the card I see bounced back the fewest in the mirror. And I think you should be considering that as a viable play line very early into the game, because it's often correct to not actually go for the card advantage in the card draw, bouncing Merlin Rabbit and using your bounce package to sort of deal with that. It can sometimes be correct, and in my opinion, oftentimes be correct, to take the more aggressive line, especially when you're on the play, and start bouncing the goats. You could get punished for this, right? And you're going to get that user feedback immediately. There's going to be a game where you choose to bounce the goats, you try to play the aggressive game plan, and your opponent has all the answers, and they stop you at like 16 lore, and you don't get there. That is the vast minority of games, in my opinion. It's absolutely a judgment call when to draw cards and when to gain lore, but please consider this card more when you are taking that more aggressive line, where you feel like you are playing the beatdown role in that matchup. It is by far what has won me the most games in the mirror. And it's why I feel favored in the mirror, even when I don't play Sorceress Spellbook. I'm playing against players that have the tech card for the mirror, that are playing the Sorceress Spellbook, and I'm winning most of them because of the way I utilize Minnie Mouse Surfer and Merlin Goat and taking the more aggressive line. Obviously, there's some context with that. If I get a whiff, if I get an idea that my opponent is potentially on the book, it is potentially in their deck, I simply cannot go late against them. That card will beat me. It will attrition me out. So it does flip my switch almost immediately where it's like, I need to actually go for this. But I highly recommend you pay attention to that dynamic a bit more. Should I be bouncing the rabbit right now? Should I be bouncing the goat? Am I the aggressor in this matchup? Do I need to be going for card draw? Do I need to be getting card advantage and trying to attrition my opponent out? It is not a simple answer. There's no one answer that sort of covers all the cases, but just think about it more when you have that Merlin Goat and you have that rabbit, because I think it's correct more often than people are giving it credit for to actually start bouncing the goat and go for the more aggro game plan. Anyway, that is a little bit of a tangent on aggro, and we talked about blue-red. I highly recommend you come out as aggressive in blue-red. Other keys in the mirror. So let's talk about Ruby Amethyst, the Ruby Amethyst mirror. Kuzco specifically, which we already kind of talked about. This card is much better than Madam Mim, often on 2. Of course, it's great with Merlin Crab on 3, but the Madam Mim on 2, when you bounce something back, while it's not a terrible play, it does get cleared by the 1-drop Rafiki that your opponent could have on board. It's just not a fantastic character. Also, Madam Mim is used for bouncing goats and rabbits, so it has an additional utility in the deck other than being a 2-drop curve to bounce your 1-drop back. So something to consider. I'd much rather go Rafiki into Kuzco, into something like Minnie Mouse Surfer or Maleficent Sorceress, than I would to play Madam Mim in the mirror. In other matchups, it's absolutely correct to play the snake. Going into turn 3 or in turn 4, Some cards you need to be looking at is, of course, the Maleficent Sorceress. That card is very powerful in the mirror, and you're going to feel the difference by playing 2. When you play someone in the mirror that's playing something like 4, they're going to be drawing a lot more cards than you, and they probably it's a little bit better, to be honest, in the mirror. Like the Maleficent Sorceress is probably better than not having it in the mirror. That being said, if you take the aggro line, they can draw as many cards as they want. And if they're choosing to play Maleficent Sorceress into Rabbit and you're going Minnie Mouse into Minnie Mouse, I believe that they're very unfavored in that exchange. Next card I want to talk about is Merlin Crab with Minnie Mouse. So this, of course, when it comes down on turn 4, can allow you to clear an opposing Minnie Mouse. It often feels like that is just a game-winning play in and of itself, and that is a play that you do on the draw. Of course, you can clear it even if you're going first, but if you're going second, your opponent will play a Minnie Mouse on 3, you'll play a Minnie Mouse on 3, they'll quest their Minnie Mouse on 4, you'll play your Crab on 4, clear their Minnie, and you're super far ahead. That being said, I would pretty much never not exert my Minnie if I was on the play to stop it from being cleared by Crab, because Crab on turn 4 is already a somewhat inefficient play, and I don't think you need to necessarily be playing around it. There maybe are scenarios contextual in a match where you could play around the Crab if you know it was in hand, but ultimately what's dangerous about not exerting the Minnie and not getting that quest value immediately is that on turn 6, or if you're in the later part of the game, you can just get Madam Medusa and you get no value out of it. So you lose that exchange. So a lot of times you have to kind of play into the Crab, even when you think your opponent has it. And it just is what it is. But it does give you some equity to gain advantage by going second in the match. Not that you should ever choose to do that, but it's something you consider because it is a very powerful play. So if you're mulliganing going second, and you maybe open something like a Minnie Mouse, you could potentially mulligan for that Merlin Crab because it's such a powerful play if you think your opponent's going to be opening with that. Lastly, in the mirror, there's really not much else to talk about. It's really just the Queen's Castle, how to utilize that. Very much a judgment call. Again, in terms of the aggro game plan, opening Minnie Mouse and then playing something like a Queen's Castle on 4 is also very powerful in the mirror. The dangerous part is your opponent can maybe on turn 3 play a Crab and then turn 4 bounce that Crab back with the Madam Mim Fox. That Madam Mim Fox will now have 7 attack, will completely clear your castle. It could be rough, but it's something you should consider. Playing castles, mostly a judgment call pretty much at all times in Ruby Amethyst, and you'll get a feel for when it's correct and when it's not. And it's very easy to get feedback when you were wrong about that because your castle will get cleared, you'll get completely blown out. But just be careful utilizing it and understand that it's one of the most powerful cards in the deck. It's absolutely one of the most powerful cards in the deck. Landing at the right time will win you a lot of games. Last thing I want to talk about, I guess here, we can also talk about the Lady Tremaine. Just think about this card. Like if you're landing... I don't know, if you're landing like key characters, like let's say there's a be prepared that happens, or you decide to be prepared and you deploy something like a Minnie behind it, or just a single character, just keep in mind that your opponent can't have Tremaine. So if you do have that redundant 1-drop in hand, you can actually insulate against that by playing your key character plus your 1-drop on top of that. You have 9 1-drops in the deck, and you can play around Tremaine. It's not always going to be applicable, but it's something you should be thinking about. Blue-red also plays this card, so not easy, but it's something you should think about in order to play around. That pretty much concludes the mirror. For me, my number one level up with the mirror is that not enough people are correctly assessing how aggressive this deck can be, and they're not appreciating the power of the aggressive strategy of Ruby Amethyst in the mirror. Most players default to taking the control role and taking the card advantage role and the attrition role. They try to play rabbits, they try to sing friends on the other side, they try to draw as many cards as possible and attrition you out. I think that if you take a more aggressive line, or at least if you consider that as a primary game plan, you'll win a lot more games. So something to consider. All right, next up, let's talk about in my opinion, your one main bad matchup. The main reason I would not play Ruby Amethyst if your metagame is dominated by Green Steel. Green Steel is a deck that is, I think, quite favored against you. They do have some opening hands, especially on the play, where you just lose. Things like the Prince John, Sig Sudden Chill, basically make you discard your whole hand and kind of lock you out of the game. They just have some very powerful openers with Merfolk on 1. That can be hard. That being said, the biggest level up I can give you for Green Steel is to dump your hand as fast as possible. Dump your hand as fast, especially if they're on Prince John, which most of them are at this point. Dump your hand as fast as possible and don't draw cards. So you're like, what does that mean? Well, this is actually a May trigger. You don't have to do this. That might sound weird, but if your opponent has a Prince John and they're not drawing cards off their Prince John because you have no cards in hand, they're actually losing a lot of value. Like Prince John is a pretty inefficient body. It's a 1/2 3 uninkable to quest for 2. If it has no other effect, it's actually a pretty bad card. So there's going to be often times when you're playing against green steel where you actually will play out a character, could be even be a Maleficent Sorceress, and you choose not to draw. Having 0 cards in hand is actually quite beneficial around turn 4 or turn 5 against something like green steel, stopping them from getting that additional value. Because if you draw cards off of Merlin Goat, Sorceress, and you just keep these cards in hand when it goes to your opponent's turn, what happens is they're going to, first of all, they're going to make you discard them, so you're not going to get value out of them. But they're also going to draw additional cards on top of that, so not only will they be used net the same result, which is you have 0 cards in hand, but they will also have more cards in hand because they've drawn cards off that. So just keep that in mind, that you should be dumping your hand as fast as possible. I play a lot of 1-drops. I'll play them out against green steel, even if they're not great bodies. And I will opt to not draw cards often. It's not always correct. It's your judgment call to draw or not to draw. But I find the heuristic is when going into your opponent's turn, who's playing green steel, it is often better to not have cards in hand than to have cards in hand when there is a Prince John on the battlefield. That might sound obvious, but trust me, it's not. Last thing I want to talk about for green steel is Queen's Castle. So they have a really hard time dealing with this card. If you can drop this on turn 4, it is very, 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 very powerful. It doesn't mean you should do it every single time. Sometimes board context, they could clear it. They've gotten these like beater bodies on the battlefield, and they can actually clear Queen's Castle and would be correct. But this card is really, really powerful in that matchup because 1, it doesn't get hit by Ursula, and 2, they basically can't clear it. And 3, if you attach this to characters on board, that's a good way to draw cards. You're drawing cards at the start of your turn. You make all your decisions on your turn. You dump your hand before you go to the green steel player's turn. So Queen's Castle, just like one of the MVPs in green steel, heuristic against green steel. Dump your hand as fast as possible and play Queen's Castle. Other than that, it is a hard matchup, and that's just kind of how it is. You have the 1 Pinocchio in the deck. I find that it is kind of effective. It's not insanely effective. It's good for hitting the 2/3 Ursula that sort of sings. Can sing things like Strength of a Raging Fire, clear your entire board. It can be effective against that. But it is not like a silver bullet. This match, this if you have this card in your hand, you automatically beat green skill. Absolutely not that at all. So it's nice when you have it, and it's nice when it kills a 2/3 Ursula. But I wouldn't be siding in more Pinocchios to try to beat green steel. All right, I want to talk about the last few matchups in the metagame which are relevant, which is Amber Steel, Blue Steel, and Emerald Amethyst. We can lump Amber Steel and Blue Steel together. Those decks have not been showing up in my metagame. While Amber Steel is an extremely powerful deck, and so is Blue Steel, they've both been looked at as the best decks in the metagame at one point. Blue-Red is simply just keeping them in check. Blue-Red is probably the most powerful deck right now. It's probably the most popular deck right now. Maybe not in paper because of card availability, but absolutely online. I think it's being lauded as the best deck. So as a result, I don't think you'll see as much Blue Steel or Amber Steel. Just to talk about those matchups, the fundamentals are, I think Blue Steel, I think you're unfavored as Ruby Amethyst. I think that's probably the hardest matchup. Even above aggressive matchups, Blue Steel is very, very challenging. I've found against Amber Steel, if they're playing Pride Lands, I believe you're favored. If they're playing Flutes, it's pretty rough. So we might see people switch over to the Flutes because there's less item destruction in the metagame for week 2. But ultimately, Amber Steel should be a pretty decent matchup for you. Just the heuristics for those matchups are generally to dump your hand as fast as possible, try to get as much value as possible before your opponent whole new worlds you and make you draw 7 new cards and discard them. The amount of cards you discard versus how many you draw in whole new world matchups is where that card advantage / card disadvantage is. So you want to be deploying as many of your resources as possible before your opponent casts that card and makes you draw a whole new 7. So something to keep in mind. We don't need to focus too much on the nitty-gritty of those matchups because I genuinely don't think they'll be highly represented in weekend 2 of the championships. The last deck I want to talk about is green, purple. So I actually have a list here that we can quickly talk about. This is from Hal from Lorcana, and this is kind of like, this is the list. This might be a newer list I think that I did deck tech on, but also I played him in the finals. I think this deck is going to rise in popularity for weekend 2 of the set championships. I do believe this is a hard matchup for Ruby Amethyst. It's not atrocious. The reason people play this deck is actually to beat up on Blue-Red. For Ruby Amethyst, you can beat this deck. It is very challenging, though. Again, the heuristics against this deck are pretty similar to green steel. The Queen's Castle is one of the most powerful cards in your deck. I would recommend against any Ursula decks during the mulligan away your songs, mulligan away your friends on the other side, mulligan away your Be Prepareds. You don't want them to get value out of this. You'll often find that good players will be inking this card because they just assume that their opponent, if their opponent is good and is on Ruby Amethyst, will also be mulliganing away their songs, so that's actually not super likely to hit. Be Prepared's tough because if it's in your hand, you mulligan into it, it's stuck there, and it is just going to get hit. But yeah, the key to this is mulligan away your song so that they don't get value out of Ursula. And Pinocchio is very, very good against this Ursula in particular. So in green steel, Ursula, Deceiver of All, is singing removal, which is, it's annoying. But in Amethyst Emerald, it's singing friends on the other side and drawing 4 cards. So it's a big problem. You really got to get rid of this. This deck, I think people confuse this deck and they think about this deck as an aggro deck. This deck is very much a mid-range deck, and it can outgrind you as Ruby Amethyst because of that Ursula. They draw 4 cards every single time they sing friends on the other side with it. They have a lot of tempo cards in it, like Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo and Mother Knows Best. They have the Prince John Sudden Chill package. It's a hard matchup, but ultimately you need to be doing kind of the same thing against green steel. Mulligan to sort of dump your hand. Pinocchio is more powerful in this matchup. And of course, the Queen's Castle is very, very good. The reason why Queen's Castle is not as powerful against Emerald Amethyst as it is against Steel Amethyst, or sorry, Steel Emerald, the colors are so, is because the Emerald Amethyst, or the Emerald Amethyst, yeah, I got the thing, has Madam Mim Fox Crab. So again, crabs on the battlefield, you play Madam Mim Fox, you bounce the crab back, that's going to be 7 attack, they will clear your thing in 1 game action, which is really, really bad for you. So in my opinion, this is one of your harder matchups in the metagame. It is beatable, but yep, just do the things we talked about. Just do the things we talked about. Realize you're an underdog, and that's just how it's going to be. I do think more will show up, but you would definitely rather be playing Ruby Amethyst into Emerald Amethyst and Emerald Steel than you would be playing something like Blue Red. Blue Red is significantly unfavored, I think, and it can be a really hard matchup. Okay, so to summarize this for my tips for Ruby Amethyst, the number one takeaway you should take from this video is that Ruby Amethyst, as the aggressor in a matchup, is, in my opinion, more powerful than people give it credit for. I think that Minnie Mouse is one of the best cards in the deck right now. And I think you're going to win a lot more matchups, especially into blue-red and into the mirror. If you look at your sort of opening hand as, how can I be the beatdown, right? How can I aggro my opponent out of this game? So that means mulliganing for minis. That means getting things like Merlin Goat and prioritizing, sometimes, not all the time, prioritizing bouncing the goat instead of the rabbit sometimes. And I'm not talking about when you're at 17 lore and you do goat, snake, goat. I'm talking about when you're at 10, 12, 8. Like, you need to realize that you can flip the switch now and you're going to get to a critical maximum of lore before your opponent can Be Prepared you, or even Madam Medusa, your Minnie Mouse. You're going to get to a critical maximum where even if they have 7 cards in hand, you might be at 16, 17 lore, and all you got to do is find, stick 1 or 2 characters throughout the next 10 turns of the game, or stick a goat, and you're going to win the game. So, Ruby Amethyst, aggressive game plan, more powerful than I've seen people giving it credit for. I've not had a single opponent try to open super aggressive against me, prioritize the Merlin Goat bouncing, and I'll tell you, if I'm going second, that's the last thing I want to see. The last thing I want to see is my opponent go Minnie Mouse, Goat, something like Queen's Castle, and just start bouncing those goats, because it's really hard to come back. I think you're super favored if you come out aggressive. Anyway, Ruby Amethyst for weekend 2 of the set championships, I think, is a good pick. Again, you need practice. You need so much practice with this deck. It is not the most powerful deck. It doesn't do the most unfair things whatsoever, but it is the most consistent deck. And it does punish greedy decks. And I think there are a lot of greedy decks that are floating around. Green Steel is a greedy deck. I think Blue-Red is a greedy deck. And Ruby Amethyst is going to do its thing every single time. Ruby Amethyst also has 13 uninkables. So, I mean, it's just a consistent, streamlined deck at this. It is very much a tempo deck, not a control deck. And I think it's a great pick. I'm currently between playing Blue-Red and playing Ruby Amethyst. And while I think Blue-Red is the best deck in the metagame, I will probably be playing Ruby Amethyst once again for weekend 2 of the set championships, because I think it has the best matchup spread for my personal metagame. My metagame has a lot of green steel in it, and I really don't want to be playing blue-red into green still. Anyway, want to get this video out quick for you all. So if you're looking to pick up Ruby Amethyst for the weekend, or maybe you played it last week and didn't get the results you want to give you my tips from someone who went undefeated into events. Moyen also played this list. While he might not agree with everything I said in this video, I think we share a lot of the same thoughts. So hopefully this can help you win more games and finally get your stitch for the last weekend we have of set championships. Thank you all so much for watching the video. Check out the podcast this week, whether it comes out tomorrow or today. I'm not sure exactly when this video will come out. Check out the podcast. We do have Spessy on for this week's episode, who also won a set championship and is a big Lorcana streamer. Would love to see more listeners, or see a new audience for the podcast that maybe hasn't checked it out yet. So be sure to stay tuned. Hit that subscribe. Thank you all so much, and good luck in your set championships.